Welcome to Astounding Stories of Space and Time. I'm Mardell, and here is Part 2 of The Judas Valley by Robert Silverberg. They unhooked 4 of the 6 tabs from the wall and donned them. Then they moved on into the airlock and closed the inner door. The air was pumped out just as though the ship were in space or on a planet with a poisonous atmosphere. As far as anyone knew, the atmosphere of Formalhaut 5 actually was poisonous. Some of the tension had relaxed after a week spent in safety, but there was always the first expedition to consider. No one took chances. When all the air had been removed, a bleeder valve allowed the outer air to come into the chamber. Then the outer door opened, and the 4 men went down the ladder to the valley floor. Wayne led the way across the sand in silence. The 4 men made their way toward the slope on the western side of the valley. Overhead, the bright globe of Formalhaut shed its orange light over the rugged landscape. When they reached the beginning of the slope, Wayne stopped and looked upwards. "Doesn't look easy," he grunted. "Damned rough hill, matter of fact. McPherson, do you think you could make it to the top?" Corporal McPherson was a small, wiry man who had the reputation of being a first-rank mountaineer. He had been a member of the 18th Mount Everest Party and had been the second of that party to reach the summit of the towering peak. "Sure I can, sir," he said confidently. "Shall I take the rope?" "Go ahead. You and Minetti get the rope to the top, and Sergeant Boggs and I will follow up." "Righto, sir." Corporal McPherson reached his gloved hands forward and contracted his fingers. The tiny micro switches in his gloves actuated the relays, and his hands clung to the rock. Then he put his boots against the wall and began to move up the steep escarpment. Private Minetti followed after him. The 2 men were lashed together by the light plastisteel cable. The sergeant held the end of the cable in his hands, waiting for the coil to be paid out. Wayne watched the 2 men climb while a chill wind whipped down out of the mountains and raised the sand in the valley. It was less than 80 feet to the precipice edge above, but it was almost perpendicular. And as they climbed, the buffeting winds began to press against their bodies with ever-increasing force. They reached the top and secured the rope, and then they peered over the edge and signaled that Wayne and the sergeant should start up. "We're coming," Wayne shouted, and returned the signal. It was at that instant that he felt something slam against the sole of his heavy metamagnetic boot. It was as though something had kicked him savagely on the sole of his right foot. He winced sharply at the impact. Then, somewhat puzzled, he looked down at the boot. He felt something move under the sand. He tried to step back and almost tripped. It was as though his right foot were stuck firmly to the sand. He pushed himself back and with a tremendous heave managed to pull himself free. He braced his body against the cliff, lifted his foot, and looked at it. Hanging from his boot sole was one of the ugliest monstrosities he had ever seen. Unusually grotesque. It was about the size and shape of a regulation football and was covered with a wrinkled reddish hide. At one end was a bright red gash of a mouth, studded with greenish, gnashing teeth. From the other end of the creature's body protruded a long, needle-like projection, which had embedded itself in the metal sole of Wayne's boot. Good God! If I'd been wearing ordinary boots, that thing would have stuck clear into my foot. He hefted the weighted pick with one hand and swung, catching the monster with a point. It sank in and ripped through the creature, spilling red-orange blood over the sand. Shuddering a little, Wayne put his other foot on the dead thing and pulled his right boot free of the needle beak. He started to say something, but he had a sudden premonition that made him look up in time. Sergeant Boggs put both hands against the captain's shoulder and pushed. "What the hell?" Wayne asked in surprise as he fell from the shove. He almost fell to the sand, but he had had just enough warning to allow him to keep his balance. He put out a foot and staggered wildly. A sudden strange noise caused him to turn and look back. 5 needles were jabbing viciously up out of the sand, in the spot where he would have fallen. "You out of your head, Boggs?" he started to ask, but before the last word was out of his mouth, the sergeant charged in madly and tried to push him over again. He was fighting like a man gone berserk, which he was. Wayne grabbed him by the wrist and flipped him desperately aside. The sergeant fell, sprawled out for a moment on the sand, then bounced to his feet again. His eyes were alight with a strange, terrifying flame. Silently he leapt for Wayne. The captain slammed his fist forward, sending it crashing into Boggs' midsection. The sergeant came back with a jab to the stomach that pushed Wayne backward. Again the deadly needles flickered up from the ground, but they did not strike home. Wayne gasped for breath and reached out for Boggs. Boggs leaped on him, trying to push Wayne down where the beaks could get to him. Wayne sidestepped, threw Boggs off balance, and clubbed down hard with his fist. Boggs wandered dizzily for a second before Wayne's other fist came blasting in, knocking the breath out of him. A third blow and the sergeant collapsed on the sand. Wayne paused and caught his breath. The sergeant remained unconscious. Wayne shook his head uncertainly, wondering what had come over mild-mannered Boggs. A chilling thought struck him. Was this what happened to the crew of the Mavis? He looked up the cliff where the other 2 men were still peering over the edge. "McPherson, Minetti, come down. We're going back to the ship." He heaved the unconscious body of Sergeant Boggs over his shoulder like a potato sack and waited for the 2 men to come down. They drew near. "Boggs must have gone out of his head," Wayne said. "He jumped me like a madman." They had nothing to say, so he turned and began to trudge back to the Lord Nelson, trying to assemble the facts in his mind. They followed alongside. What was behind the attack? After seeing the monster, why had Boggs attempted to push his superior officer over into the sand? There were other little beasts under that sand. Why would Boggs want one of them, there seemed to be dozens, to jab him with its needle of a beak? And what were the beastly little animals anyway? There were no answers, but the answers would have to come soon. He tossed Boggs into the airlock and waited for the others to catch up. They climbed up the ladder and said nothing as the airlock went through its cycle and the antibacterial spray covered them. Colonel Peterson looked at him across the desk and put the palms of his hands together. "Then as I understand it, Captain, Sergeant Boggs tried to push you over onto the sand where this, monster jabbed you in the foot?" "That's right, sir," Wayne said. He felt uncomfortable. This wasn't a formal court-martial. It was simply an inquiry into the sergeant's actions. Charges would be preferred later, if there were any to be preferred. Sergeant Boggs stood stolidly on the far side of the room. A livid bruise along his jaw testified to the struggle that had taken place. One eye was puffed, and his expression was an unhappy one. Near him, McPherson and Private Minetti stood stiffly at attention. The colonel looked at Boggs. "What's your side of the story, Sergeant?" The non-com's face didn't change. "Sir, the captain's statement isn't true." "What's that?" Wayne asked angrily. "Quiet, Captain," Peterson said. "Go ahead, Boggs." The sergeant licked his bruised lips. "I was about to start up the rope when, for no reason at all, he struck me in the stomach. Then he hit me a few more times and I passed out." "Did he say anything when he did this?" the colonel asked. "No, sir." Wayne frowned. What was the sergeant trying to do? What the devil was he up to? "Corporal McPherson," the colonel said, "did you witness the fight?" "Yes, sir," the small man said, stepping a pace forward. "Describe it." "Well, sir, we were up on top of the cliff and we called, or rather, I called for the captain and the sergeant to come on up. Sergeant Boggs took hold of the rope and then the captain hit him in the belly, sir. He hit him twice more and the sergeant fell down. Then the captain told us to come down, which we did, sir." That was all." He gestured with his hands to indicate he had no more to say. Wayne could hardly believe his ears. Making an effort, he managed to restrain himself. "Private Minetti, do you have anything to add to that?" the colonel asked. "No, sir. It happened just like that, sir. We both seen the entire thing. That's the way it happened. Captain hauled off and let him have it." The colonel swiveled around and let his cold eyes rest on Wayne. "Captain, you have stated that Sergeant Boggs did not talk to either of these two men after you struck him. That eliminates any collusion." "Yes, sir," Wayne said stonily. "I talked to both men separately, and they tell substantially the same story. The records of all three of these men are excellent. The sergeant claims he never saw any monster of the type you describe, and the group I sent out to check said there is no body of any alien animal anywhere near the spot. How do you explain the discrepancies between your story and theirs?" Wayne glared angrily at the three men. "They're lying, sir," he said evenly. "I don't know why they're doing it. The whole thing took place exactly as I told you." "I find that very difficult to believe, Captain." "Is that a formal accusation, sir?" Peterson shrugged and rubbed his hands against his iron gray temples. "Captain," he said finally, "you have a very fine record. You have never before been known to strike an enlisted man for any cause whatever. I hold that in your favor." "Thank you, sir." "On the other hand, the evidence here definitely indicates that your story is not quite true. Now, we know that Lieutenant Jervis acted peculiarly after the crew of the Mavis met its mysterious end, and the medical corps thinks that whatever is causing the deaths could also cause mental confusion. Therefore, I am remanding you to the custody of the medical corps for observation. You'll be kept in close confinement until this thing is cleared up." Wayne frowned bitterly. "Yes, sir," he said. Peter Wayne sat in his cell in the hospital sector and stared at the wall in confusion. What in blazes was going on? What possible motive would three enlisted men have to frame him in this way? It didn't make any sense. Was it possible that he really had gone off his rocker? Had he imagined the little beast under the sand? He lifted his foot and looked again at the sole. There it was. A little pit about 1/8 of an inch deep. The colonel had explained it away easily enough, saying that he might possibly have stepped on a sharp rock. Wayne shook his head. He knew he wasn't going nuts. But what the hell was going on? There were no answers, but he knew that the eventual answer, when it came, would have something to do with the mystery of the Mavis's 8 corpses. It was late that afternoon when Sherry James came storming into the hospital sector. She was wearing a spacesuit and she was brandishing a pass, countersigned by Colonel Peterson himself. She was determined to enter. "The medics didn't want to let me in," she explained, "but I told them I'd wear a spacesuit if it would make them any happier." "Sherry, what the devil are you doing here?" "I just wanted to check on you," she said. Her voice sounded oddly distorted, coming over the speaker in the helmet. "You're supposed to have blown your wig or something, did you?" "No, of course not." "I didn't think so." She unscrewed her helmet quickly. "Listen, Peter, there's something funny going on aboard this ship." "I've known that a long time," he said. "I think Boggs and those other two are trying to frame you," she said, her voice low. "Do you know of anyone aboard named Masters?" "Masters?" Wayne repeated. "Not that I know of. Why?" "Well, I overheard Boggs talking to one of the other men. I didn't hear very clearly, but it sounded as though he said, 'We've got to get Moore out and turn him over to Masters.' Bill Moore is one of my computer men, tall, skinny fellow." Wayne nodded, frowning. "Yeah, but who's Masters? This is the queerest thing I ever heard of." Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. "Better put your helmet on," Wayne advised. "Whoever's coming might not like to see you this way." Quickly, she slipped the helmet back on. "I don't know what's going on," she said, "but I intend to find out." One of the medics entered the cell without knocking and came up to Sherry. "You'll have to go now, Lieutenant," he said. "We're going to perform some tests on the captain now." Sherry bristled. "Tests? What kind of tests?" "Nothing very serious," the medic said. "Just a routine check to clarify some points we're interested in." "All right," Sherry said. "You won't find anything the matter with him." She left. "Come with me, Captain," said the medic politely. He unlocked the cell door and equally politely drew a needle-beam pistol. "Don't try anything, please, sir. I have my orders." Silently, Wayne followed the medic into the lab. Several other medics were standing around watching him, with Stubblman, the head man, in the back. "Over this way, Captain," Stubblman called. There was a box sitting on a table in the middle of the room. It was full of sand. "Give me your hand, please, Captain," the medic said tonelessly. In a sudden flash of insight, Wayne realized what was in the box. He thought fast, but moved slowly. He held out his hand, but just as the medic took it, he twisted suddenly away. His hand flashed out and grabbed the other's wrist in a steely grip. The medic's fingers tightened on the needle beam and managed to pull the trigger. A bright beam flared briefly against the lab's plastic alloy floor, doing nothing but scorching it slightly. Wayne's other hand balled into a fist and came up hard against the medic's jaw. He grabbed the needle beam pistol from the collapsing man's limp hand and had the other three men covered before the slugged medic had finished sagging to the floor. "All of you, raise your hands." They paid no attention to him. Instead of standing where they were, they began to move toward him. Wayne swore and with a quick flip of his thumb turned the beam down to low power and pulled the trigger 3 times in quick succession. The 3 men fell as though they'd been poleaxed, knocked out by a low-power beam. "Whole ship's gone crazy," he murmured softly, looking at the 3 men slumped together on the lab floor. "Stark, staring, raving nuts." He took one step, and someone jumped him from behind. The needle-beam pistol spun from his hand and slithered across the floor as Wayne fell under the impact of the heavy body. Apparently the whole medical corps was out to knock him down today. He twisted rapidly as an arm encircled his neck and rammed an elbow into the newcomer's midsection. Then he jerked his head back, smashing the back of his skull into his opponent's nose. The hold around his neck weakened, and Wayne tore himself loose from the other's grasp. He jumped to his feet, but the other man was a long way from being unconscious. A stinging right smashed into Wayne's mouth, and he felt the taste of blood. Hastily, he wiped the trickle away with the back of his hand. With his nose pouring blood, Wayne's antagonist charged in. His eyes burned with a strange flame that had been gleaming in Boggs' face out in the desert in the valley. He plowed into Wayne's stomach with a savage blow that rocked Wayne back. He grunted and drove back with a flurry of blows. The other aimed a wild blow at Wayne's head. Wayne seized the wrist as the arm flew past his ear and twisted hard. The medic flipped through the air and came to rest against the wall with a brief crunching impact. He moaned and then lapsed into silence. Quickly, Wayne grabbed the gun off the floor and planted his back to the wall, looking around for new antagonists. But there was evidently no one left who cared to tangle with him, and the 4 medics strewn out on the floor didn't seem to have much fight left in them. Wayne crossed the room in a couple of strides and bolted the door. Then he walked over to the box of sand. If it contained what he suspected. He stepped over to the lab bench and picked out a long steel support. He stepped outside the medic section and locked the door behind him with a key he'd taken from Stubblman. After turning the needle gun back to low power again in order to keep from killing anyone, he started on tiptoe toward the stairway that led to the bowels of the ship. After about 10 paces, he saw a shadow on the stairway and cowered in a dark recess, while 2 crewmen passed talking volubly. Once they were gone, he came out and continued on his way. It took quite a while to get to where he was going. since it involved hiding and ducking 2 or 3 more times along the way. But he finally reached the big compartment where the water repurifiers were. He climbed up the ladder to the top of the reserve tank, opened the hatch, and emptied the contents of the jar into the ship's water supply. "That ought to do it," he said to himself. Smiling, he carefully smashed the jar and dropped the fragments down the waste chute. He surveyed his handiwork for a moment, then turned and headed back. He hadn't been seen going down, and he didn't want to be seen going out. If anyone suspected that he had tampered with the water supply, all they would have to do would be to run the water through the purifiers. That would undo everything Wayne had been carefully preparing. He made his way safely back up to the main deck and headed through the quiet ship toward the airlock. He wasn't so lucky this time. A guard saw him. "Where are you going, Captain?" the guard demanded, starting to lift his gun. "Seems to me you ought to be in the brig." And Wayne made no reply. He brought his gun up in a rapid motion and beamed the man down. The guard toppled, a hurt expression on his face. Wayne raced to the airlock. He didn't bother with a spacesuit, not now, when he knew the air outside was perfectly harmless. He opened the inner door and closed it, and opened the outer door. Then, grinning gleefully, he pressed the button that would start the pumping cycle. The outer door started to close automatically, and Wayne just barely managed to get outside and onto the ladder before it clanged shut. As soon as the great hatch had sealed itself, the pumps started exhausting the air from the airlock. No one could open the doors until the pumping cycle was over. He climbed down the ladder and began walking over toward the western wall. He would have to keep away from the ship for a while, and the rocks were as good a place as any to hide out. It was dark. Fomalhaut had set, leaving the moonless planet in utter blackness, broken only by the cold gleam of the stars. The light streaming from the portholes of the Lord Nelson gave a small degree of illumination to the valley. The valley. It was spread out before him, calm and peaceful, rippling dunes of sand curling out toward the mountains. The valley he knew was a betrayer, calm and quiet above, alive with an army of hideous vermin a few feet below its surface. He started to walk, and moistening his lips, he knew he was going to get awfully thirsty in the next few hours. But there was not the slightest help for it. There hadn't been any way to carry water from the ship. "I can wait," he told himself. He stared back at the circular bulk of the Lord Nelson behind him, and his fingers trembled a little. He had known when he joined the Corps that space was full of traps like this one. But this was the first time he had actually experienced anything like this. It was foul. Something slammed into his boot sole, and this time Wayne knew what it was. "Persistent, aren't you?" He jerked his foot up. This monster hadn't struck as the other one had, but he saw the tip of the needlebeak thrashing around wildly in loose sand. Wayne thumbed the gun up to full power, and there was a piercing shriek as the gun burned into the sand. There was a sharp, shrill sound, and the odor of something burning. He spat. The little beast must be all over the floor of the valley, scurrying frantically like blood-red giant crabs, sliding up and down between the valley, searching upward for things to strike at. How they must hate his metamagnetic boots, he thought. He kept on walking, expecting to feel the impact of another thrust momentarily. But he was not molested again. They must be getting wise, he thought. They know they can't get through my boots. And so they're leaving me alone. That way they don't call attention to themselves. A new, more chilling question struck him. Just how smart are they? He had made it to the wall and was climbing up the treacherous slope when the airlock door opened and someone stood outlined in the bright circle of light that cut into the inky blackness. An amplified voice filled the valley and ricocheted back off the walls of the mountains, casting eerie echoes down on the lone man on the desert. "Captain Wayne, this is Colonel Peterson speaking. Don't you realize that you're a sick man? You may die out there. Come back. That's an order, Captain. Repeat. Come back. That's an order." "I'm afraid an order from you just doesn't hold much weight for me right now, Colonel," Wayne said quietly to himself. Silently, he went on, climbing an escarpment, digging into the rough rock. He kept on climbing until he found the niche for which he had been heading. He dragged himself in and sat down as comfortably as possible. He began to wait. Dawn came in less than 3 hours as Fomalhaut burst up over the horizon and exploded in radiance over the valley. With dawn came a patrol of men slinking surreptitiously across the valley, probably with orders to bring him in. Wayne was ensconced comfortably in his little rock niche, hidden from the men in the valley below, but with a perfect view of everything that went on. The wind whistled around the cliffs, ceaselessly moaning a tuneless song. He felt like standing up and shouting wildly, "Here I am! Here I am!" But he repressed the perverse urge. The patrol group stood in a small clump in the valley below, seemingly waiting for something. Moments passed, and then it became apparent what that something was. Hollingwood, the metallurgist, appeared, dragging with him the detector. They were going to look for Captain Wayne with it, just as they had searched out the double-nucleus beryllium. Wayne frowned. It was a possibility he hadn't thought about. They could easily detect the metal in his boots, and he didn't dare take them off. He'd never make it back across that hellish stretch of sand without them. He glanced uneasily at his watch. How much longer do I have to keep evading them, he wondered. It was a wearing task. It looked as though it would be much too long. The muzzle of the detector began to swing back and forth, slowly and precisely, covering the valley inch by inch. He heard their whispered consultations drifting up from below, though he couldn't make out what they were saying. They finished with the valley, evidently concluding he wasn't there, and started searching the walls. Wayne decided it was time to get out while the getting was good. He crawled slowly out of the niche and wriggled along the escarpment heading south, keeping low so the men in the valley wouldn't see him. Unfortunately, he couldn't see them either. He kept moving, hoping they wouldn't spot him with the detector. He wished he had the metamagnetic hand grapples with him. For one thing, the sharp rock outcroppings sliced his hands like so much meat. For another, he could have dropped the grapples somewhere as a decoy. Oh well, you can't think of everything, Wayne told himself. He glanced at his watch. How long was it going to take? He heard the scrape of boot leather on a rock somewhere ahead of him. He glanced up sharply, seeing nothing, and scowled. They'd spotted him. They were laying a trap. Cautiously, he climbed over a huge boulder, making no sound. There was one man standing behind it, waiting apparently for Wayne to step around into view. He peered around, trying to see who it was. It seemed to be Hollingwood, the dignified, austere metallurgist. Wayne smiled grimly, picked up a heavy rock and dropped it straight down square on the man's helmet. The plex alloy rang like a bell through the clear early morning air, and the man dropped to his knees, dazed by the shock. Knowing he had just a moment to finish the job, Wayne pushed off against the side of the rock and plummeted down, landing neatly on the metallurgist's shoulders. The man reeled and fell flat. Wayne spun him over and delivered a hard punch to the solar plexus. "Sorry, Dave," he said softly. The metallurgist gasped and curled up in a tight ball. Wayne stood up. It was brutal, but it was the only place you could hit a man wearing a space helmet. One down, Wayne thought. 58 to go. He was alone against the crew. And for all he knew, against all 59 of them. Hollingwood groaned and stretched. Wayne bent and for good measure took off the man's helmet and tapped him none too gently on the skull. There was the sound of footsteps, the harsh chitch-chitch of feet against the rock. "He's up that way," he heard a deep voice boom. That meant the others had heard the rock hitting Hollingwood's plexalloy helmet. They were coming toward him. Wayne sprang back defensively and glanced around. He hoped there were only 5 of them, that the rule of 6 was still being maintained. Otherwise, things could become really complicated as they hunted him relentlessly through the twisted gullies. He hated having to knock out too many of the men. It just meant more trouble later. Still, there was no help for it, if he wanted there to be any later. He thought of the bleached bones of the crew of the Mavis and shuddered. It was something of an advantage not to be wearing a helmet. Even with the best of acoustical systems, hearing inside a helmet tended to be distorted and dimmed. The men couldn't hear him as well as he could hear them. And since they couldn't hear themselves too well, they made a little more noise than he did. A space boot came into view around a big rock, and Wayne aimed his needle beam at the spot where the man's head would appear. When the head came around the rock, Wayne fired. The man dropped instantly. "Sorry, friend," Wayne apologized mentally. 2 down, 57 to go. The odds were still pretty heavy. He knew he had to move quickly now. The others had seen the man drop, and by now they should have a pretty good idea exactly where Wayne was. He picked up a rock and lobbed it over a nearby boulder, then started moving cat-like in the other direction. He climbed up onto another boulder and watched 2 men move away from him. They were stepping warily, their beam guns in their hands. Wayne wiped away a bead of perspiration, aimed carefully, and squeezed the firing stud twice. 4 down, 55 to go. A moment later, something hissed near his ear. Without waiting, he spun and rolled off the boulder, landing cat-like on his feet. Another crewman was standing on top of a nearby boulder. Wayne began to sweat. This pursuit seemed to be indefinitely prolonged, and it was beginning to look unlikely that he could avoid them forever. He dropped the pistol during the fall. It was wedged between a couple of rocks several feet away. He heard someone call. "I got him. He fell off the rock. We'll take him back down below." Then another voice ominously. "He won't mind. He'll be glad we did it for him. Afterwards." "I'll go get him," said the first voice. The man stepped around to the side of the boulder just in time to have a hard-pitched rock come thunking into his midsection. "Ugh!" he grunted and took a couple of steps backwards and collapsed. 5 down, 54 to go. I could go on like this forever. "What's the matter?" asked the man who had replied to the first one with those chilling words. "Nothing," said Wayne in a fair imitation of the prostrate crewman's voice. "He's heavy. Come help me." Then he reached down and picked up the fallen man's beam gun. He took careful aim. When the 6th man stepped around the rock, he fired. The beam went wide of the mark, slowing the other down, and Wayne charged forward. He pounded 2 swift punches into the amazed crewman, who responded with a woozy, wild blow. Wayne ducked and let the fist glide past his ear, then came in hard with a solid body blow and let the man sag to the ground. He took a deep breath. 6 down, only 53 to go. He crawled back to the edge of the precipice and peered down into the valley. There was no one to be seen. It was obvious that Colonel Peterson was still enforcing the 6-man rule. As he watched, he saw the airlock door open. A space-suited figure scrambled down the ladder and sprinted across the deadly sand of the valley floor. It was Sherry. Wayne held his breath, expecting at any moment that one of the little monsters beneath the sand would sink its vicious needle upward into Sherry's foot, but her stride never faltered. As she appeared near the precipice, another figure appeared at the airlock door and took aim with a gun. Wayne thumbed his own needle-beam pistol up to full and fired hastily at the distant figure. At that distance, even the full beam would only stun. The figure collapsed backwards into the airlock, and Wayne grinned in satisfaction. 7 down, 52 to go. He kept an eye on the airlock door and a finger on his firing stud, waiting to see if anyone else would come out. No one else did. As soon as Sherry was safely up to the top of the precipice, Wayne ran to meet her. "Sherry, what the devil did you come out here for?" "I had to see you," she said, panting for breath. "If you'll come back to the ship before they beam you down, we can prove to Colonel Peterson that you're all right. We can show them that the masters—" She realized suddenly what she had said. She had her pistol out before the surprised Wayne could move. He stared coldly at the pistol, thinking bitterly that this was a hell of a way for it all to finish. "So they got you too," he said. "That little display at the airlock was a phony. You were sent out here to lure me back into the ship. Just another Judas." She nodded slowly. "That's right," she said. "We all have to go to the masters. Her eyes glazed and she swayed on her feet. The pistol wavered and swung in a feeble spiral, no longer pointed at Wayne. Gently he took it from her nerveless fingers and caught her supple body as she fell. He wiped his forehead dry. Up above, the sun was climbing toward the top of the sky. Its beams raked the planet below, pouring down heat. He glanced at his wristwatch while waiting for his nerves to stop tingling. Sherry must have been the last one. The drug must have taken effect at last, and not a moment too soon. He decided to wait another half hour before he tried to get into the spaceship just the same. The huge globe of the Lord Nelson stood forlornly in the center of the valley. The airlock door stayed open. No one tried to close it. Wayne's mouth was growing dry. His tongue felt like sandpaper. Nevertheless, he forced himself to sit quietly, watching the ship closely for the full half hour before he picked up Sherry, tied his rope around her waist, and lowered her to the valley floor. Then he wandered around the rocks, collecting the 6 unconscious men, and did the same for them. He carried them all, one by one, across the sand, burning a path before him with a needle beam. Long before he had finished his task, the sand was churning loathsomely with needles of hundreds and thousands of the monstrous little beasts. They were trying frantically to bring down the being that was so effectively thwarting their plans, jabbing viciously with their up-thrust beaks. The expanse of sand that was the valley looked like a pincushion, with the writhing needles plowing through the ground one after another. Wayne kept the orifice of his beam pistol hot as he cut his way back and forth from the base of the cliff to the ship. When he had dumped the 7 unconscious ones all inside the airlock, he closed the outer door and opened the inner one. There was not a sound from within. 59 down, he thought, and none to go. He entered the ship and dashed down the winding staircase to the water purifiers to change the water in the reservoir tanks. Thirsty as he was not going to take a drink until the water had been cleared of the knockout drug he had dropped into the tanks. After that came the laborious job of getting everyone in the ship strapped into their bunks for the takeoff. It took the better part of an hour to get all 60 of them up. They had fallen all over the ship and nestled in the acceleration cradles. When the job was done, he went to the main control room and set the autopilot to lift the spaceship high into the ionosphere. Then, carefully sighting on the valley far below, he dropped a flare bomb. "Goodbye, little monsters," he said exultantly. For a short space of time, nothing happened. Then the viewplate was filled with a deadly blue-white glare. Unlike an ordinary atomic bomb, the flare bomb would not explode violently. It simply burned, sending out a brilliant flare of deadly radiation that would crisp all life dozens of feet below the ground. He watched the radiation blazing below, then it began to die down. And when the glare cleared away, all was quiet below. The valley was dead. When it was all over, Wayne took the hypodermic gun from his pouch, filled it with the anti-hypnotic drug that he had taken from the medical cabinet, and began to make his rounds. He fired a shot into each and every one aboard. He had no way of knowing who had been injected by the small monsters and who had not, so he was taking no chances. Then he went to the colonel's room. He wanted to be there when the commanding officer awoke. The entire crew of the Lord Nelson was gathered in the big mess hall. Wayne stared down at the tired, frightened faces of the puzzled people looking up at him and continued his explanation. Those of you who were under the control of the monsters know what it was like. They had the ability to inject a hypnotic drug into a human being through a normal space boot with those stingers of theirs. The drug takes effect so fast that the victim hardly has any idea of what has happened to him. But why do they do it? It was Hollingwood, the metallurgist, looking unhappy with a tremendous bruise on his head where Wayne had clobbered him. Why does a wasp sting a spider? It doesn't kill the spider, it simply stuns it. That way, the spider remains alive and fresh, so that young wasps can feed upon it at their leisure. Wayne glanced over to his right. Lieutenant Jervis, you've been under the effect of the drug longer than any of us. Would you explain what really happened when the Mavis landed? The young officer stood up. He was pale and shaken, but his voice was clear and steady. Just about the same thing that almost happened here, Jervis said. We all walked around the valley floor and got stung one at a time. The things did it so quietly that none of us knew what was going on until we got hit ourselves. When we had all been enslaved, we were ready to do their bidding. They can't talk, but they can communicate by means of nerve messages when that needle is stuck into you. Nearly half the crew nodded in sympathy. Wayne studied them, wondering what it must have been like. They knew. He could only guess. Naturally, Jervis went on, those who have already been injected with the drug try to get others injected. When everyone aboard the Mavis had been stung, they ordered me to take the ship home and get another load of Earthmen. Apparently, they like our taste. I had to obey. I was completely under their power. You know what it's like. And what happened to the others, the 8 men you left behind? Asked Colonel Peterson. Jervis clenched his teeth bitterly. They just laid down on the sand and waited. Horrible, Sherry said. Jervis fell silent. Wayne was picturing the sight and knew everyone else was too. The sight of hordes of carnivorous little aliens burrowing up through the sand and approaching the 8 Earthmen who lay there, alive but helpless. Approaching them and beginning to feed. Just when the atmosphere began to grow too depressing, Wayne decided to break the spell. I'd like to point out that valley's been completely cauterized, he said. The aliens have been wiped out. And I propose to lead a mission to reconnoiter for the double nucleus beryllium. He looked around. McPherson, Boggs, Minetti, you 3 want to start over where we left off the last time? Sergeant Boggs came up to him. Sir, I want you to understand that... I know, Boggs, Wayne said. Let's forget all about it. There's work to be done. I'm sorry I misjudged you, Wayne. If it hadn't been for your quick action, this crew would have gone the way of the Mavis. Just luck, Colonel, Wayne said. If it hadn't been for those heavy-soled climbing boots, I'd probably be lying out there with the rest of you right now. Colonel Peterson grinned. Thanks to your boots, then. Wayne turned to his team of 3. Let's get moving, fellows. We've wasted enough time already. Do we need spacesuits, sir? Minetti asked. No, Minetti, the air is perfectly fine out there, Wayne said. But I'd suggest you wear your climbing boots, he grinned. You never can tell when they'll come in handy. Out there in space, you've got to know who you can trust. Join me next week for the finale to Astounding Stories of Space and Time, Season 1. Until then, watch the skies